Before I begin, I would just like to acknowledge the spacious safety of this place. This community provides a very safe container for everything that we bring to it, our grief, our joys, our concerns, and just wanted to lift that up and appreciate it with you all. Ever since I looked at the preaching theme, and Sheila will know that this sermon has gone through a few iterations since we last spoke, but ever since I looked at the preaching theme for May, the opening lines of an old Frank Sinatra song kept running through my head. I'm really dating myself. Imagination is funny. It makes a cloudy day sunny. Makes a bee think of honey just as I think of you. Imagination is crazy. Your whole perspective gets hazy. Starts you asking a daisy what to do, what to do. Now they just don't write lyrics like that anymore. And then about 2 weeks ago, give or take a day or two, I was walking by the chapel here, down Main Street with a friend, and I met up with Jack Street and Rita Brown. I told Jack he'd be getting a mention in the sermon here. They were sitting in the car on the curb, and they had a small sign with them, and across that sign in about 2.5, 3-inch letters was the word resist. Jack asked me what I thought people would think when they saw the word resist. I didn't have a ready answer, and I'm guessing all kinds of things could be read into the word these days, so I just kind of tucked Jack's question away in my brain for future reference. But it wasn't long before I began thinking about the word resist juxtaposed with the idea of imagination. And then, as night follows the day, the question was, what role does imagination play in resistance? And I was surprised, Google has all kinds of information. When I looked up relationship between imagination and resistance, there's a whole discussion in literature, in philosophy, in theater, and in art about the relationship between imagination and resistance, and that was way too complicated for a relatively brief sermon. And literature and art and philosophy are not really my major medium. That being said, however, thoughts about the relationship between imagination and resistance kept hanging around. As the quote at the top of our bulletin says, the quote from John O'Donohue, the imagination retains a passion for freedom. There are no rules for the imagination. It never wants to stay trapped in the expected territories. The old maps never satisfy it. It wants to press ahead beyond the accepted frontiers and bring back reports about regions that no map maker has yet visited. So like breadcrumbs being offered on the path, and it's amazing how often that happens, a 1978 copy of Walter Brueggemann's book, The Prophetic Imagination, ended up on my desk again to be revisited for maybe the 100th time, and several threads began weaving themselves into a sermon. Perhaps, according to Brueggemann, one thing the world needs today is more prophets exercising the power of imagination, where a prophet is understood as someone who pushes against the normal order of society and culture, a society that has set itself up at the expense of the marginal, the outcast, the poor, the weak. Walter Brueggemann calls this normal order of society the royal consciousness. We've been exposed to a little bit of that kind of thinking in the last 100 days. Not too much of a stretch of interpretation to see it as a characterization of our own national and cultural situation. We might also refer to the royal consciousness as the powers that be, or the administration, or Washington, D.C., or any of the other ways of naming it that might come to you. The characteristics of a culture of royal consciousness include several things. First, the royal consciousness fosters an economics of affluence in which people are just well enough off that the pain of the world is not in the center of consciousness. Second, a royal consciousness embodies a politics of oppression, in which the cries of those in the margins are ignored and not heard. And third, perhaps the most insidious, a royal consciousness cultivates a religion of immanence and accessibility, the kind of religion in which God is understood to be so present that the absence of God is never noticed. Think about the kind of religious practice where the practitioner has absolute certainty about the nature and the work of God in the world. This God is usually used to make the practitioner feel good and right and righteous and unarguably saved. Think about white Christian nationalism. What Brueggemann calls the royal consciousness leads people to the brink of despair about hope for a fuller and more satisfying future control. When this happens, the people fall more completely under the fog of the royal consciousness as it becomes the new normal. And it's the task of prophetic imagination to bring the people back to a point where they can engage the promise of newness and vitality, creativity again. Brueggemann writes that the task of prophetic ministry is to nurture, nourish, and evoke a consciousness and perception alternative to the consciousness and the perception of the dominant culture around us. Nurture, nourish, and evoke an alternate consciousness to the one in which we find ourselves. And Brueggemann also argues that the prophet does not contend against this royal consciousness with arms and use of force, but with a much more powerful weapon of imagination and creativity. So we might think about Moses against Pharaoh, a leader rising up to guide an enslaved people to liberation. Or the prophet Jeremiah, an unpopular figure to be sure. People wanted to throw him into a pit and put him in prison, and he spoke truth to power against a corrupt monarchy. Or we might think of a Jesus who preached loving kindness and forgiveness and compassion against the crushing power of Rome. But Walter Brueggemann isn't so interested in locating individuals who might fulfill this prophetic vision. Rather, he argues that it's the task of the prophetic community to present an alternative consciousness that can energize the larger community to fresh forms of faithfulness and vitality. So we surely are balanced on a threshold between hopelessness and despair on the one hand, and the quest for an energizing newness that fills us with hope on the other. In the midst of the dynamics of a royal consciousness that is really a lack of consciousness of what a just society might look like, in the midst of those dynamics, we become acutely aware that we are here at this point in time because of a fundamental failure of imagination. Power structures of the royal consciousness are simply and tragically and dangerously unable to imagine anything more generous or compassionate as a way into the future that works for people at all levels of society. There have been individuals in modern times that fit the mold of the biblical prophets, Martin Luther King Jr. being among them, but it's really hard to discern and identify a strong prophetic voice these days. And it may be that the individual voice crying in the wilderness is simply not enough. What is required now is for whole communities of faith to choose to exercise a prophetic imagination, to envision every day a world where justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. I've been reading the sermons of Meister Eckhart. He was a 14th century German mystic who, by the way, was seriously dissed after his death by the Pope. He didn't quite fit the model of what the church was at that time. But he reminded his student priests that ancient tradition affirms that human beings are created in the image of the divine. And he wrote this: "The imago Dei, or the true likeness between humans and the Creator, is the capacity to make images." Eckhart talks of the treasure of images that flow out of this most divine aspect of our human psyches. Think of that. Our creative imaginations are a divine capacity for creating images for an almost unimaginable future. This is what the prophetic imagination represented. What a commission it is to dream and express a future that no one thinks is imaginable, to bring into public consciousness the expression of the hopes and the yearnings that are presently being denied and suppressed. The dreams of bodily autonomy, of freedom of expression, food security for all, adequate shelter for even the least of the least, and of a justice that fulfills the primary biblical injunction: do no harm or wrong to the stranger. Creating such a world begins with our corporate imagination, with awakening to our holy calling to use our imaginations to envision the world that seems unthinkable in the midst of the current burden of the royal consciousness. Out of the prophetic imagination comes the sheer poetic vision of a time when natural enemies will be reconciled and live in peace and harmony. A vision of a time when the wolf and the lamb will lie down together, and the lamb will live to tell about it. Hear these metaphorical words of the prophet Isaiah. The wolf shall live with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the kid, the calf and the lion will feed together, a little child shall lead them, the cow and the bear shall graze, and their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put its hand in the adder's den. They will not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. This is the prophetic imagination at work. And we know that throughout history, the vision for wholeness has always been largely aspirational, never fully accomplished. But to let go of imagining and envisioning what that wholeness for humankind might look like is to give up hope. And giving up hope is what the royal consciousness requires of us in order to stay in power. So, imagination, a most powerful and insidious form of resistance. The prophetic imagination, a gift we share in common with the divine, readily available to each one of us, and available even more powerfully when we activate it in community. Imagination is funny in a most subversive and resistive way. It takes us way beyond asking daisies what to do. As Brueggemann challenges us, it is the task of the prophetic community to present an alternative consciousness that can energize the larger community to fresh forms of faithfulness and vitality. We know how to do this. So be it.